Hello, welcome to an episode of Around the Corner. Today I am with Don Gibson, a film teacher and historian from New York, and we are going to talk about a couple of movies, Bonnie and Clyde and Where Eagles Dare. Both of these movies we picked based on looking at movies from 1965 to 1968 in the action genre. So we're going to start off by Don introducing Bonnie and Clyde.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, Bonnie and Clyde is a really interesting film for me for a couple of reasons. One, it's a really entertaining film with great action sequences and, familiar names. So Warren Beatty's in it and Faye Dunaway and Gene Hackman as well. But it's also really interesting. It's considered one of the new Hollywood films in that it was challenging the studio norms of the day. So not shot in studio, not just about entertaining people, although it was entertaining. It also had these aspects that were making us think about what is film and why do we watch, and like Bonnie and Clyde are interesting characters because they're outlaws and they did bad things, they killed people, and yet we're thinking they're good in the film. And so it's interesting because they were, at the time, Hollywood was actually not doing well at the box office. Some people thought television was getting a lot of control back and people weren't going to the theater as much. And so Hollywood was considered a bit of a slowly turning into a dinosaur in a way. People were, it was kind of repetitious studio productions. And this film was influenced by the European movements, primarily the French New Wave, Francois Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard. They did films like Breathless and 400 Blows. And, they're artsy films, but the surprising thing, they were very popular at the time because they had these challenging existential, interesting philosophical ideas. They were also, challenging because there was, they pushed the realm a little bit with nudity and language. And so people thought that was kind of interesting. American films were quite a ways away still from, violating those codes. And this was influenced by that movement. So it is just an action film. Bonnie and Clyde, as I said, is a story of outlaws. But we're looking kind of at the mind space of Bonnie and Clyde and what kind of people they are.
Well, can you tell me, Don, maybe you could talk a little bit about how the movie got started. What was the origin of getting the movie filmed?
So Warren Beatty at the time was like the big sex symbol of the 60s, like Brad Pitt, George Clooney. Well, these days, I guess we've got new people coming up. Those are the people I remember really well that recently. So he was the big star, and basically he was a star vehicle. So you put him in a movie and people would go see a Warren Beatty film. But he was really interested in making challenging films. And he loved the French New Wave, and he knew Francois Truffaut, and he actually tried to get Truffaut, who was leader of this movement, the French New Wave, to direct the film. And he was interested briefly, but then he went on to do another film called Fahrenheit 451, which was a story by Ray Bradbury. So he did that instead. And so then Beatty took the project on himself,
He was a producer, right? He was one of the producers?
He was a primary producer. People would argue, he was actually more than a producer because the producer does all the background kind of, hiring and, the business side of things. But he actually, philosophically was very much involved in it as well. So the director was Arthur Penn. And he did other films later. The Missouri Breaks was one film, and he did direct this film. But some people, and he also did Little Big Man, a film with Dustin Hoffman in the early '70s. But a lot of people think Dustin Hoffman was really the visionary behind this piece.
I mean, Warren Beatty?
What did I say? Yeah, Warren Beatty.
Yeah, you said Dustin Hoffman. But...
Yeah, not Dustin. Dustin Hoffman was the star of Little Big Man. That's why.
Yeah. Which also was a film that had a very different style to it as well. Yeah.
It did, yeah.
I think Arthur Penn probably complemented a lot of the vision of what Warren Beatty wanted in regards to having the courage to kind of make a picture like this in a still, manufactured production studio centered thinking process of the executives. So, I think obviously, I don't know if this picture would have been made if it wasn't for Warren Beatty using his star power to kind of push it forward.
I agree. Warren Beatty was definitely the person that made this film happen. That's what most people think. And then when they made it, like, and it's interesting too, because he made it at Warner Brothers Studios, and Warner Brothers historically was known to make gangster films. So in the 30s, each studio had its genre, and everyone, if you wanted to see a Warner Brothers film, you're going to go see a gangster film. And they'd sort of gotten rid of that definition. They wanted to move on, because then there's a point where people think, I don't want to go see Warner because they're gangster. And so it was a little bit, Beatty had to convince Jack Warner, who was who ran the studio at the time, and he showed him the picture. And when they started, he was, I don't really know about this gangster thing, but they gave him the project because it was Warren Beatty. And then when they were watching it, there's a good story about if Jack Warner got up to pee in the middle of the film, it was a bad sign because he was bored and he went to pee. And this film he went through 4 times, and then they're thinking it was a disaster. And Jack Warner was like, I don't even know what this thing is. And so when they made it, they did it grudgingly. They released it basically as a B movie. They were thinking, well, there's a lot of shooting in it, and Warren Beatty's in it, Faye Dunaway, and so it'll be, these B movies were really popular at the time, which are basically just exploitation films. And they released it in the drive-ins, and it did incredibly well. People started talking about it, not just as an exploitation film, but as a film that had, moments that are, reflective of what it means to be a gangster. Bonnie, historically, and in the film, writes a poem about what it means to be a gangster. The film opens with quite a beautiful sequence that goes on for like a minute, where Faye Dunaway, quite tantalizingly, is naked in her bedroom, sort of walking around, and she's holding the bars of her brass bed, and it looks like she's in prison.
Kind of like a trapped tiger or lion in a cage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
just like wanting to get out, constantly looking out the window, looking at her image.
Yeah, and that was very European or French New Wave, because there was really no purpose to the opening shots. And it was, people would say, Faye Dunaway's a beautiful woman, and we're seeing her mostly naked. And so it's kind of, for Americans at the time, the censorship was pretty strong, and that would have been quite shocking. And so it opens with scenes like that. And then also the scenes they have, there's also the relationship between Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, which is really interesting, because it's basically asexual. They do their first bank robbery together. Then afterwards, they have this moment where we think they're going to engage in some sort of sexual intercourse. And then Warren Beatty just says, I don't want to do this. I'm not that kind of guy.
Yeah, it was really weird. It was. Yeah. He's kind of like, I'm not. It's just, it doesn't do it for me. I'm not. I choose not to. He's like, he goes, I'm not gay or anything, but
Exactly. And for a Hollywood film, that's incredibly surprising. We would never expect to see that. We always expect the guy to be a man or macho, et cetera. And Faye Dunaway is beautiful. And historically, there's references to potentially Clyde in jail, and maybe he had an experience of being molested, but his relationship with Bonnie, there really is no evidence that the evidence is that they were sexually active, and they, I guess traditional, and we don't really know, but Warren Beatty and Arthur Penn took this idea quite far, and they made, like, Faye Dunaway's character, Bonnie was very upset with this, the lack of interaction.
Yeah, she's definitely the aggressor in the relationship in regards to this area. And that whole sequence after that first robbery, it actually kind of complicates the characters in a way that as the viewer, you're not really expecting this. It's like almost like they flip the roles a little bit on the traditions, and so you're starting to think, oh, this film has something. There's something going on here that you're not seeing in a normal film. Yeah,
I totally agree. That's a really interesting aspect about it, is how strong she is, the female lead. Because female leads generally, they maybe have a couple of strong lines, or they do a couple of good scenes, but they're always second tier to the guy. They kind of go back and forth, because Warren Beatty's Clyde is pretty strong too, but on the sexual issue, she's definitely the aggressor, and she's definitely the more powerful character.
What did you think of her being cast into that role, Faye Dunaway?
As a casting?
Yeah, as selecting Faye as
yeah. I think she's a really fascinating choice. I mean, later, I guess about 3-4 years later, she was in Chinatown, Roman Polanski's Chinatown, opposite Jack Nicholson. And I'd say these films really compare well for her. Once again, she is a powerful lead. Jack Nicholson's more of a traditional lead for sure. He's definitely a sexual aggressor in that film. But I would say in a way, she's kind of like the 60s, early 70s Meryl Streep. She's a very strong character actor. She's not traditionally beautiful or I don't know, whatever, the Hollywood blonde kind of thing. But she definitely has a very strong sense of character and very strong sense of portrayal of the character of Bonnie.
She wasn't the first pick either, right? I mean, there was a whole process of that actual character casting was quite the search was quite in depth, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, but in the end, she was an excellent selection. I mean, I think the other characters like Gene Hackman, he was brought out. He's the brother of Clyde in the film, and this is one of his early roles as well. I think this, and also Gene Wilder was his very first role. So I think a lot of risks were taken on all roles except for Warren Beatty. Even CW is a very kind of I don't know the actor's name, but he's a very kind of an odd looking fellow, and he's a very interesting character to have in an action gangster film.
I think his name is Pollard.
Yeah. And I think it's the only film he's known for.
Yeah, no, I've seen him in some quirky supporting roles, like in a Star Trek episode and some random things. I felt like the selection of the supporting characters. Clyde's brother, Gene Hackman, hits a home run. I mean, he was so good. You could right away, you're going to see Gene as a star in Hollywood. He was just so, charismatic and just a very good actor. The quality just immediately pops, And then Pollard was this kind of weird, quirky little guy, And then Gene Hackman's wife, who actually, I believe she won an Oscar for this, Estelle Parsons. She was very good in this as well. And, interesting enough that she later on would play Roseanne Barr's mother in Roseanne, which really, stuck with me the whole movie, because it almost feels like the character just kind of grew into Roseanne Barr's mother. It's like the same style of annoying character, because, I mean, we could both agree that by far she was the most annoying part of this movie, and intentionally so,
Yeah, she's incredibly annoying. I mean, there's the sequences, especially where she argues a lot with Bonnie. Bonnie, of course, hates her because she represents some sort of middle class, disaster.
Stability.
But all these action sequences, she's always screaming, and she screams in the most unpleasant, exhausting way that we just can't stand her. An interesting story is the only person to survive, the only living person when this film was made was her. And she was very upset with the portrayal of her, and she tried to stop the production, and they didn't do it. And she thought it was a very unfair portrayal, how, as you said, irritating that she was portrayed. I mean, we just despise her, even though, she's an innocent person kind of drawn into this thing, into these series of robberies that she doesn't even want to do in the first place.
So what do you think about how the time in the U.S. and how it impacted the storyline a little bit? What did you see that kind of connected with the current culture at that time in the 60s?
Do you mean how it's portrayed, how we see it today, or how?
No, I mean the movie. Obviously, there were some instances I felt in the movie where the tension in the culture at the time in the 60s might have been influenced a little bit in how the movie played out in the storyline. Did you get a sense of that at all?
Oh yeah, very much so. And that's why the film did so surprisingly well, because funnily enough, Hollywood didn't really understand how important the demographic of basically the teenager up to the mid-20s, how key that is to success of a film. They didn't really pay attention to them, and the drive-ins had just arrived. So the film has definitely a counterculture appeal to it of fighting the system. It's Bonnie and Clyde against the world, and that feeling, of course, was going on in society with the cultural revolution of the 67 flower power and the sexual revolution and these things. And so that they tapped into that I guess zeitgeist of the moment that Hollywood didn't understand at all at the time. They didn't get that you got to tell stories about how people are living today. They don't want to see giant spectacles like Cleopatra and, Paint Your Wagon that have nothing to do with how people feel today. And even though the film is portraying, the Depression era, which was 40 years, 35 years before, it was about being, not being understood by society and expressing yourself and who she is and or who we are. And that also goes back to what we're talking about, Faye Dunaway's portrayal of Bonnie. It was so strong and so powerful, and she wanted to be who she was. And that was, partly of the sexual revolution of women saying, if I want to do whatever I want to do, then you have to, you have no say over me.
I felt too that there was a lot of messaging about the youth at that time. The expectations coming out of the 50s and 60s was, you have a role that we want you to fill, and that's the way, we want you to kind of develop as an adult. And I kind of feel like this movie was very much connecting to the youth, because they didn't want to necessarily fill this role that their parents wanted them to fill. And so there was a little bit of a rebellious sense in that, we're not you, and we're going to go the way we want to go. And Bonnie and Clyde maybe spoke to them, because they definitely chose a course that was not accepted at that time, and it was not the expectation of what they were supposed to, grow into as young adults. And I think that, Bonnie and Clyde, and then we look at some other movies, The Graduate, where we see that the young roles, they don't have a clear vision of what their future is going to be, and they're not necessarily, they feel the pressure of these parents and these older generations, but they're not necessarily responding that way. They want to go down the path that they want to go down. And I think Hollywood was starting to finally hear that message when they see the popularity and success of a movie like Bonnie and Clyde. They start, letting the development of movies that don't have that strong visionary goal of the main character, and letting them kind of figure out the directions they want to go while the movie's in process,
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's funny because Hollywood does tend to move kind of like, a giant corporation like Ford or GE at times, because they always, right now we're in the era of the superhero film, and they understand it's a cash business, and they're like, this, they keep making these films and people keep going, and they'll just keep playing it out until it won't work anymore. And similarly, films made by Black filmmakers, previously they've always thought, oh, we should do this because it's the right thing to do, and you have to be socially conscious. The stupidity is they're really popular films because there's an awful lot of, first of all, Black people in the country, but also people that often the cultural message that it's being offered, like you're saying here, it's not, they're saying a story about people that we know and are interested in. I mean, you'll look at rap and hip hop music. It's not, people don't like it because we want to be nice to a culture that's been downtrodden. It's really good. And the same thing here, a lot of the Black filmmakers coming up today, a lot of the films are really good because they have a lot of stories to tell. And same thing with this film. It's a really interesting story that's challenging the way society is. And at the time, young people were challenging the way society was, and they wanted a message that connected to them.
Interestingly enough, a movie like that actually has a much better chance of being made today than it did back then, because the studios do not monopolize the system anymore. With streaming, there's so much need for content because of all the streaming channels, and there's a shortage of good quality content that people want to watch. And so, I think that, we're seeing a lot more experimentally and challenging productions because of the availability of streaming channels and productions that want to buy, a larger range of media, because, not everybody wants to just watch that superhero movie every year, the next sequel to whatever, right? I mean, people want to be challenged, and there's a lot more intellectual depth that is being demanded, because you can be more nichey now, because with the streaming channels, it provides a lot more opportunity for viewing and returning the costs.
Well, and especially now too with the pandemic. I mean, I don't know what the studios are going to do to figure out releasing their films, because they've always, the studios have always been based on the first weekend weekend or 2, 3 weeks. And of course, that paradigm doesn't exist right now with so limited theaters that are available. So I'm curious to see what the next Bonnie and Clyde will be and how we'll move forward, and the industry might change in its vision.
So, are there some things that you want to talk about in specific scenes about the movie that really impacted you, or you feel would be interesting to the listener?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a number of really interesting scenes. Pretty good car chases. The shootouts are very interesting. They use an awful lot of squibs, which are the little blood capsules, and it was an innovation at the time. So there's an awful lot of blood. It's not as gory by today's standards, of course, but there's a lot of blood. There's a couple of shots where people get shot like right in the face, which is at the time very surprising. And I do show this film to my class, and I have students that are they've seen it all, they know it all, and they're definitely surprised by a couple of these scenes. The most interesting scene, of course, is the death of Bonnie and Clyde. It's the last 3 or 4 minutes of the film, and I'm not giving anything away here because anyone knows. I think everyone knows Bonnie and Clyde were killed. But the way they're shot is quite graphic and it's excessive. And the editing is really quite remarkable in that in about 30 seconds or so, there's about 100 shots, and so that means there's a shot like every third of a second. And the editing is so rapid. You really have to see the scene a couple of times over to really understand what happens. There's a lot of metaphorical stuff with birds flying and then editing back and forth between Bonnie and Clyde's face. And, as a film, in terms of film theory, it's a great film to analyze because you can write a lot about it. But just as a viewer, it's really quite an experience. It goes so quickly, and then you're kind of left wondering what happened. And there's a couple of great final shots. We see Bonnie's dead body through a bullet hole in the window of the car. And that's one of our last shots of the film. So it's a very powerful, metaphorical, but I guess you'd say entertaining and very thoughtful.
It's certainly not a happy ending.
Not a happy ending. No. And in history, lots of people question why the officers did this. They riddled their bodies with bullets. They could have just ambushed them and captured them. A lot of people believe they didn't even have to shoot them. But these, Bonnie and Clyde actually ended up creating the Federal Bureau because they would just cross borders state lines after they robbed banks. And so if you're in Oklahoma and you're crossing to Texas, the Oklahoma guys wouldn't go to Texas. They figured this out. And because the other people were doing it too, which is Bonnie and Clyde, they actually created the Rangers and the Federal Bureau, and I think they were a little bit vengeful. And
yeah, I think there was definitely considering the amount, Bonnie and Clyde were not hesitant to shoot and kill law enforcement, and so they had racked up some. They were very dangerous people, and in the movie took the liberty of having Clyde come out of the car, but in actuality, that ambush, they never made it out of the car. I mean, they as soon as the car slowed down to a stop, all of those law enforcement men opened up, and they were never able to exit the car, and that so in a part of that was because they were considered so dangerous and well armed that nobody wants to expose themselves.
And that car actually, and the bodies, I mean, it's so morbid afterwards. The car, I think, is still somewhere in Texas.
Yeah, I think it was for years. I think they actually toured it as a circus or a carnival exhibit.
If people in the Depression would pay like 10 cents to see the car.
Yeah.
But the bodies too, my goodness, when they had their open caskets, there was thousands of people that wanted to see their dead bodies, and it was really.
Well, they were considered folk heroes at the time.
Oh, they were folk heroes, yeah.
But I mean, the reality is that they were hardened criminals that didn't hesitate to shoot to kill, and so I think the law enforcement. They knew that, and they didn't want to risk their lives unnecessarily by trying to capture them alive.
Yeah.
So, well, I think that's a very good analysis of Bonnie and Clyde. I think we looked at a lot of different areas, and I think we should move on to our next film, which is Where Eagles Dare. And I'm going to go, and I'll start off by giving a little introduction about that movie. It is a more of a traditional studio movie. It was filmed much of it was filmed on location in some castles in Bavaria, and Austria as well. And the film came out, I believe, in 1968. It stars Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood. And interestingly enough, the film was actually, the origin of the film is Richard Burton's stepson had this vision of putting Richard Burton in a just a traditional war movie where he's kind of the hero of the war movie, and that drove the connection with the author of the book and the screen play that ended up being the basis of this film. And the name of the author was Alistair. Is it Alistair MacLean? Is that right?
Alistair MacLean. When I was a teenager, I loved his books. Always the great spy films, and always a double agent somewhere. He did Ice Station Zebra, Where Eagles Dare. Oh, there was a whole bunch, and they're just page turners. You read them in a weekend, you do nothing else.
Right. And so, he was brought on, and that book was written very quickly, and the screenplay was written shortly after that. So we're talking like a 6-week turnaround on producing the screenplays. And basically the storyline of the movie is, a World War II general from England is shot down in his plane on the way to a meeting with the Russians, the Soviets, in Greece to start the negotiations to open up another front against Hitler and the Nazis. And his plane is shot down, and the Nazis capture this general. And then the British decide that they're going to put together a rescue team of special operations forces that will go into this area and infiltrate the castle and rescue this general. So that's the obvious scenario. But then we find out throughout the movie that in fact this is all actually a setup of the British to discover all the spies that they have the Germans have in the British military and in England. And Clint Eastwood, who is one of the members of the Special Forces team, was brought in as the American expert. He's kind of like the American Special Forces killing machine, and it's a typical Clint Eastwood role that we see a lot, and he has he has perfected this role at this point. And the interesting thing for Clint Eastwood actually on this movie was he was a little hesitant because Richard Burton got the top billing and he was the number 2 guy, and so there were his team of people. They were a little hesitant, but they thought, what, let's try this out and see what happens. And you would think, with these type of conflicts, there would be, I want more lines. How many lines do I have, or how many lines does he have? But actually, Clint Eastwood went the other way with this. When he reviewed the script, he said, no, my character has too many lines. This isn't who I am, And so he actually told them to take some of the lines out because he'd rather just go around killing people and blowing things up and not have to talk about it.
Yeah, well, that's definitely his brand. I mean, his brand is Dirty Harry, and the man with no name from the Few Dollars More series. It's just looking over people and having a gun and having a pithy line at the end of a mass killing of some kind.
Yeah,
but to have a lot of dialogue with anybody.
Yeah, he definitely perfected the strong silent type.
He's strong and silent for sure.
Yeah. So anyway, so the characters they get on the plane. They go to the team goes to Germany, and they whatever you call it, paratroopers. So they parachute out of the airplane, the team, and then as the last teammate member, we see a little twist because out of the cockpit or some closet or something, right, this beautiful blonde woman appears, and they tell her, okay, you ready? And she jumps out, and they don't know about her. Yeah. So it's kind of like a little twist in the.
I would say the best thing about this film is the 2 things. First of all, the opening sequence of the plane. There's a white plane that's a camouflage plane flying through the mountains. It matches the mountains. It's got the Nazi insignia on it. And it's this great opening 3-minute shot of the plane flying through the mountains, which is, a classic adventure of it's kind of like a Mission Impossible earlier. Something's going to happen. It's a beautiful shot with the mountain. And then, of course, the intrigue. You're thinking, oh, this is just a typical, war movie, going to kill a bunch of Nazis. And then they all jump out, and then this closet opens, this woman gets out, and you're like, who's that? And then she jumps out, and of course, the rest of the film, we're left guessing the entire time.
Oh yeah, right away. Once the special team forces land in the snowy meadows, they find one of the bodies of the team members, and he's dead. But then they find out that actually he was killed. It wasn't an accident. And then, we start losing team members as the operations happen. And then we start wondering, what else is going on there? There's obviously some kind of second or third plot line happening here. And as they infiltrate the castle and they become more complications. And then we find out eventually about the middle of the movie. And by the way, this movie is incredibly complicated in the shooting schedule was just crazy. I believe in my notes, I see that they had 1,400 edits in the movie, which means that they were editing about, the average shot length was about 6 seconds. So there, and with the action sequences, and so much of it was shot on location, that's an incredibly complicated shooting schedule.
And for the time, it's as well, because now I think we see films that are similar like that. If you go to an Avengers film, I couldn't even tell you how many shots they have, but it's digital, and this is actual physical film, so it's much more expensive. And to edit all the physical film is a really complicated thing, opposed to having, a computer and then, going through. Now there's a whole system to doing Avengers. Yeah. Whereas here, the editor would have been a really exhausting trying experience.
I can't imagine, with all the different camera angles and the amount of stunts in this movie is incredible. I mean, they because there's no, like you said, there's no computer digitalization here. This is all being filmed with real stunts. And in fact, in a couple of the explosions, the director was actually seriously injured during the movie. He was burned very, very badly.
I did one scene when a guy's thrown off the cable car. They really use a green screen. It's a little bit, it's like, okay, this is the 60s. It's not quite as convincing as you might expect. But I'd say that's the only moment. There's maybe a couple little bits, but that's the only scene where you're like, okay, that's not so believable. Otherwise, a lot of the action sequences are believable because they were actually running around, and a lot of stuntmen doing it.
Yeah. One of the jokes about the film was Clint Eastwood actually called it "Where Doubles Dare," because stunt doubles were getting more screen time than the actual actors because the amount of stunts and action in the movie. Yeah. And so
he was kind of irritated about that, wasn't he? He wanted to do more stunts, and they kept pulling him off.
Yeah, I think as insurance companies were becoming more powerful in the film industry, he wasn't able to make those choices. I think he did do some of his own stunts, but for a lot of it, he had his stunt double was in the shots. And the other interesting thing is there are some scenes where Richard Burton had no problem with his stunt double doing as much. In fact, he probably was you can do this scene as well. You could do this scene as well.
He probably wasn't even there half the time.
Yeah. I mean, certainly there are some great stories about him, and he was hard partying at this point in his life. Some people were saying he was drinking multiple bottles of alcohol a day, and he had some friends coming over to visit the set. Some very famous stars. I don't remember. Do you remember some of their names?
Peter O'Toole was one, and another well-known
Harris,
guy.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, they were famous acting buddies. Peter O'Toole was one.
Yeah, and they were running hard, so he would be missing for a couple of days on these binges. And and you can see in the movie there are some scenes where you think, oh man, he's not looking too good. Yeah. Besides the problems of being behind enemy lines in a castle trying to kill everybody, but he just looked like he had a bad morning or something. And so there are definitely some scenes where maybe he's just kind of telephoning it in a little bit. And, you can see that. There's a scene where they're climbing up a castle wall, and Richard Harris looks like he's just a monkey climbing up the wall. I'm sorry, Richard Burton.
Richard Harris is one of his drinking buddies. So
Richard Harris was one of his drinking.
Yeah.
So and Burton just looks like he's climbing up that wall like a monkey. And then you see Clint Eastwood climbing up the wall, and he's like struggling because he actually climbed up the rope in the wall, but Richard Burton had a crane that actually lifted him up that was camouflaged, so it looked much easier for him to do it.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. That's the way I would.
Well, why put it in that kind of effort if you have the technology to make it look like you're putting in that kind of effort?
Why
Right?
not do it?
Yeah, right. Exactly. So in the end, the movie, it turns out there's so many plot twists, and that they end up being successful, capturing all of the information that they wanted about the spies in England, and you see a lot of complications because Clint Eastwood, he's the trusted outsider, but he's even deceived at certain points where he's just following along as a loyal team member to Richard Burton. But there are some scenes where he feels like he doesn't know what's happening and he's a step behind as well. And that goes throughout all the movie, all the way to the very last scene where you find out that the senior officer who was in charge of putting together the team turns out to be one of the spies, and ends up he's given the option of taking his own life or going to trial, and he just jumps out of the airplane.
Hey,
And,
that would be a spoiler alert.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think we've pretty much, the spoiler alerts for both the movies are well. If you haven't seen these movies, then you definitely are going to be disappointed with all the information we just gave you. Sorry.
Well, that's one of my favorite moments of the film is they say, "What are you going to give me any options here?" Because they figured out he's the Nazi and now he's going to be taken back to England to be tried. It's like, well, there's an option, and then then the camera pans away from him, and then we just see the open door on the airplane.
No, he opens the door. He actually,
he opens it, but
then he walks down. He walks down the plank like on a ship. He was walking down the plank. He opens it was so British. It was so British how they ended that. I'll just go ahead and take my own life so I don't embarrass the country and my family.
But I would say this film is actually kind of similar to Bonnie and Clyde in the sequence before that. There's a long sort of they're on a bus. They're being chased from the castle.
Yeah.
And there's this really long sequence of blowing a bridge up and being chased and shooting back and forth and people getting shot. And that's actually very similar to how Bonnie and Clyde were shot. There's all these sequences where they're a getaway car and and then shootouts they have in the police in a motel. And these shootouts they're very similar in terms of production value, even though they're such different films in tone.
Oh yeah, I think that there's a kind of the homage to the old the gangster car chase and things of that nature. Definitely, the Bonnie, especially with Bonnie and Clyde, because it just brings you back to that time and the old cars driving, shooting out of the back of the windows and the front of the windows, and very much the classic gangster kind of car chase, cops and robbers kind of thing. And with Eagles Dares, I mean, where Eagles Dare, you see that same kind of classic World War II. Escape and get through all the checkpoints and the different crossing the bridge and then blowing up the bridge. All the classic, World War II or just any war movie where you're going through those anxiety-ridden chases, and are they going to make it? And is this going to be successful?
There's a great moment when they're undercover still and they're in the tavern, and then the Nazis come in and said, "Okay, we figured out there's spies here, basically." And so Clint Eastwood and Richard Burton look at each other and say, "What do you want to do?" And they say, "Oh, it's probably easier we deal with it outside than in here." So they just turn themselves in, and then then they're in a car, and then they overpower their guards, etc. But it's just the way they cope with it is like, okay, well, we have a better chance out there. It's like, all right, I guess.
Yeah. We'll just go ahead and turn ourselves in, and then we'll break out later.
Yeah, we'll break out later. So,
it was a simpler. It just felt like a simpler time the way they made this movie in the classic kind of World War storylines and things of that nature. But then they also put in a lot of those little twists that made it just a little bit more interesting. And when I was a kid and watching this movie, I just remembered just being wowed by it, watching it with my cousins in the den, and my uncle was asleep on the couch, because he passed out, and we were just trying to be quiet while we're watching it. But it was always an exciting. He loved watching these films as well, and so it just brought back that childhood memory of watching movies like this. But then when I watched it this time, I was like, oh my goodness, they could probably have chopped off 30 minutes from this movie easily, because it just, the depth of some of the things that they go through in these scenes, you're just like, okay, you don't have to show me that shot again from this angle. I get what's happening. It just, they must have got paid by the foot for film, because it was just so long.
I think that's the thing. Since they had all these great shots, they decided, we're just going to show them all because everyone's going to come see it anyway because we have such star power. And Alistair McCrane wrote it, who was very popular at the time. And they figured, no one's going to not come because it's long. And they were right. It was very successful at the time. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, even today, there's some pop culture connections to it. That broadsword calling Danny Boy. That's something that we've seen in. I believe there's a Iron Maiden uses that as an opening to some of their songs, and there's definitely a lot of pop influence based on Clint Eastwood. This was the #1 movie in regards to people he killed in any movie that he was ever in. So he killed more people as a character in a movie in this film than in any of the other films that he ever shot, which is, considering the amount of people he's killed in all of the movies he's been in, that's pretty impressive that this is the movie where
well, he was Dirty Harry, and Dirty Harry was known for killing people. So definitely.
Yeah, and then Unforgiven. I mean, he went through quite a few people.
Yeah. Although he wasn't so keen on killing people in Unforgiven.
Yeah, in his younger days, maybe.
He got pretty mad at the end of the movie, that's for
sure. Yeah. And then, they interviewed some people about the history of this film, and Steven Spielberg even said that this was one of his favorite war movies as well. And he actually ended his little interview by quoting the broadsword calling Danny Boy, because that was such an impactful part of the movie in regards to the pop iconic.
And there's great scenes in it. The very idea that they have a cable car going from the town up to the castle, and then they're going to do these fight sequences on a cable car. For the time, this is so exciting. It's like, oh, the cable car, we know that something's going to happen, and they use it like 3 or 4 times, and in the end, the cable car is blown up, and there's so many great fight sequences.
Yeah.
The tension's great. You're fighting on top of a cable car, and someone's going to fall off. So
you can see the connection to some of the James Bond's movies.
100%. It's very much
a lot of that style of I think they even had some cable car stuff in one of the James Bond movies as well. But they were trying to find interesting ways to have action sequences and putting them into the movies.
Exactly.
Definitely, very much connected to kind of the Ian Fleming, James Bond style movies.
Yeah.
So anyway, I thought it was a good movie. Are there some, we talked a little bit, you've introduced some comparisons, but are there some things in this movie and in Bonnie and Clyde that you see as being similar or different?
Well, I mean, I think they're pretty different in many ways, but I mean, definitely the action sequences, I think you can draw connections. And then also both have quite strong female leads. In Where Eagles Dare, there's 2 female spies that do what they're supposed to do. They're secondary, but they're definitely strong. They're not. There's a Nazi, there's an evil SS officer that's going to try to kill one of them, and she's fearless all through that. So they're very strong. They're still quite secondary. They're not really one of the main people.
And I definitely their sexuality is much more.
Sexuality is the primary. But interesting enough, the same with Bonnie and Clyde. The first time we see Bonnie, she's naked and she's sexualized. And she sexualized the film, but we see her in provocative clothing and postures. But at the same time, she's a very strong character, and she is portrayed as someone that kept pushing. Who cares? Let's when there's a federal agent that's about to capture them, and then they turn the tables and they capture him instead. She's the one that really wants to humiliate him, and she's very cruel in it, and it's all her ideas. So the female characterizations would probably be the most. There's interesting comparisons, but definitely
well, it's definitely that she's a main character too, and the depth that they put into that character. I mean, one of the disturbing scenes to me about her was after they have the big bank robbery where CW is driving, and then they go to the movies to kind of chill out, and CW and Clyde are just kind of dealing with their PTSD from the robbery, and the movie's playing in the background, and she's actually watching the movie and getting annoyed that they're talking out their feelings about the whole thing and what happened, and they're trembling and still kind of dealing with it.
You're right.
Like, I'm trying to watch the movie, and you can just see that. Wow, she's cold-blooded, like no problem with what happened. She's past it, and now she's watching this movie.
I totally agree. Yeah.
So it's interesting. The transition of the difference in these movies in regards to the studio system at the time, because I think when I look at Where Eagles Dare, I'm looking at the classic studio picture in the model that they wanted, and in Bonnie and Clyde, we're seeing an emergence of this new style of American film that's greatly influenced by what's happening in Europe, but it's much more groundbreaking and experimental. And so you're kind of seeing the end of one system and the beginning of another between these two
I
movies.
agree. I mean, one, we have Bonnie and Clyde. We have a sort of an existential questioning of why we are who we are, and lots of good, lots of great dialogue and questions, and they're part of the film. They're action oriented about what they're going to do next and how are they going to get caught. But they're definitely questioning, a lot of things just about who we are. And in Where Eagles Dare, it's like Nazis are bad and English are good, and let's kill the Nazis, and we all agree on that. And
yeah, there's a clear mission and purpose in Where Eagles Dare. And Bonnie and Clyde, it's just kind of, we're living for now, and we'll see what happens. And it turns out not so well.
Yeah, and of course, the big difference is our heroes are killed in the end of Bonnie and Clyde, and they survive, of course, in Where Eagles Dare.
Yeah, and the heroes are flipped. The bad guys are the good guys, and the good guys are the bad guys.
Yeah.
So overall, do you have any final points you'd like to make about these two films?
Well, I think they're two great films. I think you're right. There's they're very different in tone. And Bonnie and Clyde is a shorter film. I think it's like an hour and 40, 50 minutes. So it's much more compact. And I think you might even be left thinking, and the ending definitely is very sudden. So Where Eagles Dare is a film that could be trimmed in parts, but it's still great. They're both really enjoyable films that definitely evoke the time they were made.
Yeah, I think there's some great comparisons, but there's also some real strong contrasts in how we're seeing the film industry evolve in the 60s. In regarding that, even one film that we see as kind of the oldest was actually made after the Bonnie and Clyde. So Where Eagles Dare was actually filmed a little bit later, within a year or so, but we're seeing that influence of this new style of filmmaking that as we move into the later part of the 60s and early 70s is going to become a big bank funding of the studio system. They're going to start making money off this style of movies, and they're going to be a lot more supportive. So it's an interesting, I agree, it's an interesting comparison. And I think these are both great films to watch if you like action movies. And, this timeline in the late 60s, they still hold up, I think, as good films that you can sit down and enjoy.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Don, for coming on. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen, and stay tuned for our next Around the Corner.